Joining us today for this segment of Q&A is Phil Bouchard. He spent a number of years working for MECC. Philip not only worked at MECC, but was also the project leader for its most successful product, the Oregon Trail. Last year, his book, You Died of Dysentery, was published and is available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Right now, he joins us via Skype. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Ben. Good talking with you.
All right. Well, first off, can you explain how you actually got involved with MECC as a company?
Oh, yes. Back in the 70s, I was very interested in pursuing a career of developing educational materials for a mass audience. But it was really unclear as to how to go about that. So I was studying both the subject areas I was interested in, which was primarily biological sciences and also computer science, and also film, because I figured it would either be computers or film. Ultimately, I decided to go the route of computers, and then I tried to find a company to work for. And I visited all kinds of places in 1980 trying to find a company that would actually hire a professional developer and designer of educational software. And they did not exist in 1980. It was entirely a field for amateurs. Luckily, I was given some tips at several locations that check out this organization called MECC that's in Minnesota. If anybody's going to hire a professional, it'll be MECC. So I wrote them in 1980, and it took a while, but I eventually was able to join their staff in May of 1981.
All right. Going back a little bit, and I know you weren't directly involved with the original 1972 Oregon Trail game, but could you explain how that original 1972 text-based game came about, or just sort of like a brief history of what you know about how it was developed?
Sure. The original idea came from a young man named Don Rawich, and he was a student studying history and also going after his teaching credentials at the time. And he was doing his student teaching in Minneapolis in history, and he wanted to come up with some idea that would excite his students. So he had this idea of a board game based on Oregon Trail. Then when he told his two roommates about this idea, both of whom were also student teachers and who had a math background, they said, why don't you do that same idea as a computer game? So they quickly threw something together because they only had 2 weeks to do it, and came up with a little game to play in that classroom. Don tested it out. It worked well. And then he put it aside for like 4 years. Then 1975, he pulled the idea out again and still had the code written out, uploaded it to the MECC timeshare system, which was a brand new timeshare system that was available to students and teachers all over the state of Minnesota. And that became the beginning of the very famous use of that game within Minnesota on the timeshare system.
I understand that MECC ported that original version over to the Apple II, and it was that version that was technically the first to have graphics. So how did that Apple II version from like 1980 or around that time lead to what would be the 1985 Oregon Trail that we all know?
Well, it led directly to it in several ways. That first Apple II version was the one that spread outside of Minnesota because the timeshare version was only available to students and teachers within Minnesota. So that one was actually one of several games on a product called Elementary Volume 6, I believe it was. And but the fame of this game spread far and wide. The problem was that by 1984, it was completely out of date technologically because all the products that anybody created in 84 were done by amateurs, amateur programmers, amateur designers, and the world had completely changed by 1984. Everything that by that date was being done by professional designers, professional programmers. Furthermore, our techniques had evolved. Even though we were still using an Apple II, we had learned how to do, not just us, but everybody in the industry had learned how to do much more sophisticated looking products. Finally, the other thing was that MECC decided it was time to get into the home market. And they wanted to go into the home market with a really great product. So they said, okay, it's time to replace this old Oregon 2 game. Let's take that concept and run with it, something much bigger. And I was lucky enough to be the one put in charge of leading that effort.
So would you say that the 85 Oregon Trail was the first professional educational game developed with graphics?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that we were hopping onto a trend because beginning around 82, things started changing. People started creating much more professional-looking products, started hiring professionals to work on products. By 84, it was quite prevalent in the industry. So MECC was basically joining that trend of creating professional products instead of amateur products.
When the 85 Oregon Trail, the development began, about how many people were involved in the beginning, and then how many ended up being involved by the end?
Oh, okay. It's a bit tough to count because it's easy to count the core team, but it's a bit tough to count all the people peripherally involved. But I'll try to give a stab at it. So there were 5 of us on the core team at the beginning. One of them had to drop out halfway through to join other projects. So that left 4 of us on the core team. Beyond the core team, we had 2 additional programmers that joined us for important roles. Their roles were not for the whole product, but just for specific parts. Then we had a lot of people who were involved in Q&A. What am I trying to say here?
Quality check?
Quality assurance, yeah, there's no and in there, it's just QA. So a bunch of QA folks. We had other people who were involved in designing the packaging, who were involved in creating the marketing plan. We had other people who were involved in editorial, that is laying out the text that we gave them for the manuals. And it just kind of goes on and on. Lots of people involved in one way or another. But the core team, there was 4 of us on the core team from the beginning to end.
Well, a lot of thought went into the details of the game. Like, for example, the computer algorithm that takes into account the surface bottom of the rivers. That's something that players at the time, I don't think, really even realized was done. But so what led to focusing on those kinds of details for the game?
Part of it was simply when I was put in charge of the project. So we had a different designer on the project for the first 3 weeks. And her background was as an English teacher. So naturally, she was going at it from the standpoint of how can we use this in English instruction? So she was looking at it primarily from the standpoint of, let's do an activity where you're reading diaries of people who actually took the journey. It was an intriguing idea, but it didn't really work with our goal of creating this home market product that would be really exciting. It sounded more like a school market product. So when I was put in charge of this particular design, I had a very strong and extensive background in designing simulations. I had done that throughout graduate school. And I really wanted, and since Oregon Trail really was a simulation, even the original timeshare one was a simple stripped down simulation with a set of 7 or 8 basic parallel mathematical formulas that were used to update state variables every 2 weeks. I took that aspect had a lot in common with all the stuff I'd been doing in grad school. So I decided, okay, I'm going to really build on that. I'm going to make a much more elaborate, much more detailed and nuanced simulation model with lots and lots of various state variables. Each one is described by a set of mathematical formulas. What else would you like me to say about that particular topic?
Well, I didn't want to go too much into the computer algorithms. That was something, reading your book, I thought was interesting that much effort went into it, because as a player, I didn't realize that. Even as an adult player, I didn't realize that, that much detail went into it. So that kind of fascinated me that amount of detail went really into a game like that.
It's a bit like an iceberg. You see the tip of the iceberg, and you don't see all that under the water.
That's a good analogy for that. The original gameplay screen was it just sort of consisted of a shot of a landscape with the date and weather info. Can you explain how that travel screen went from just the player looking at a picture to the now iconic image of the ox pulling a wagon?
Sure. So before we programmed the alpha version of the product, I did my very best to come up with what I thought was a great design. And as we as we did the first testing with kids, we were testing to see, okay, how is this all working out? Well, one of the key aspects was this screen that you look at as you travel from landmark to landmark, which we call the travel screen. And we already had some clues that my travel screen might not be working too well when we tested it amongst ourselves before going to the kids. And sure enough, this beautiful scene of the prairie just wasn't engaging the kids. Nothing was moving. The only thing changing was the numbers on the screen. So we knew we had to change something, and we started brainstorming. It was primarily me and my 3 other principal team members. But as we were chatting, one of our colleagues walked up, a guy who wasn't even on the project. His name's Bill Way. And he just kind of threw out an idea. He said, well, why don't you put a little wagon on there and have it, moving, animated across the screen? So we thought, yeah, let's give that a try. And starting with that idea, we had to make change after change after change in order to actually accommodate that idea and to optimize that idea. And by the time we were finished with all this long series of changes, we had a completely different travel screen, and it worked. It really worked quite well. And as you say, it became the iconic screen of the product, the de facto branding of the product.
Yeah, exactly. From a software standpoint, most of MECC's products were written in AppleSoft Basic, but most of the Oregon Trail is written in assembly language. Can you explain why assembly language was used instead of the AppleSoft Basic?
Sure. I'll offer a small correction on that, in that the Oregon Trail is a mix of the two. And
yeah, I think I might have misspoke, but I think I meant most of it was written in assembly language, and I think a portion of it was written in AppleSoft.
Right. So it's an interesting case study. By that time, we were no longer doing any of our products in 100% AppleSoft because it just limited us too much. We could not do professional-looking products strictly in AppleSoft. So what we were doing is that we were using a set of tools, primarily a set of tools that allowed us to make better use of the high-res screen. It allowed us to put text of any style and any size on any place on the screen. It allowed us to put block graphics, color block graphics of any arbitrary rectangular size on the screen and to place them. Tools like this were very important, and we would create it. So we created in assembly language a set of subroutines that would allow us to do that for all of our products. Now on Oregon Trail, we went a step farther, and that was we had an action game as one of the components, and that is the hunting game. And the action game just didn't work using that approach of AppleSoft calling a limited set of assembly language routines. So we had to get special permission from my supervisor to bring in an assembly language programmer, Roger Shimada, to program the hunting game. So the hunting game is 100% assembly language, and the rest of the product consists of a top layer of AppleSoft calling various assembly language routines. Now this makes an interesting contrast with another product I was working on at the same time, which was Word Munchers. And Word Munchers was our very first product that was 100% in assembly language, because the whole game is action.
That I actually did not know that. Going back to, you just mentioned the hunting part, or the hunting part of the game. That was a big part of this original 72 version, and it's something that you guys wanted to keep in. But it seemed to be, when you guys were doing the testing, you knew that you wanted to have this game appeal to both genders, both boys and girls. And I guess the girls weren't really a big fan of the hunting part. Can you explain the process that went through the development of the hunting portion of the 85 game?
Oh, sure. The hunting was in there right from the start, as you pointed out. In the text version, you would have to type bang when told to do so. And then in a later version, they expanded that where you wouldn't know what they would ask you to type. It might be bang, pow, or something else. Then when the first Apple version came out, it was still mostly a text game, but it had 2 places in the game where there were graphics. And one was a hunting game, where you could shoot at a slowly animated deer moving across the screen. They also had animated shooting at other things. You could shoot at a wolf who was attacking you, or you could shoot at bandits who were attacking you, or you could shoot at hostile riders who were attacking you. So one of my decisions early on was they got rid of all these attacks and just kept the hunting aspect. But then to appeal to girls, I wanted to do a number of things. First of all, I wanted to be able make it possible to get to Oregon without hunting if you really wanted to. If you started with enough money and you made appropriate decisions along the way, you could get there without hunting if you wanted. I also wanted to make sure that the game appealed to different learning styles and different game playing styles. So I tried to put in lots of different activities that would appeal to both genders, so that there would be a good mix of things for people, for kids, regardless of what kinds of games they like to play.
In the book, you mentioned how one of your goals was creating a game that had replayability. And I think that many developers want that, while few really kind of achieve it, let alone an educational game. How do you feel that Oregon Trail accomplished that goal of replayability?
Well, that was something I put a great deal of thought into, because up to this point, MECC had never created a product for the home market. Everything was for the school market. And in the schools, typically in those days, you only had a very limited number of computers. Each kid only would have a limited amount of time on the product. Most of the products were optimized for the students to get their full value out of it in maybe an hour or 2 hours. And that was it. The kids seldom got more than 2 hours exposure to any given product. In contrast, going to the home market, I knew I had to create something that would have somewhere between 20 and 40 hours of good play in it. One possibility was to create an adventure game, where a typical adventure game, you just keep trying at it, you fail, keep trying at it, you fail, and it takes you maybe 40 hours to actually get all the way to the end. I didn't want to go that route. I wanted to do something where you could taste success much sooner than that, but then you could replay it, and the new experience, every time you replayed it, you'd have a new experience. Something would be different about it. So it was then based on this idea of modules that would have data-driven modules that would change according to the data, change according to the random events going on. A great deal of ideas, all contributing to this idea of a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar every time you played it, so that you would always you would enjoy that taste of familiarity, but never be bored by it being the same as before. Yeah. What else would you like to hear about that?
That was very interesting. The rafting portion at the end of the game is one of the most memorable parts, and I understand that you also wanted to include a puzzle-like game for those who wanted to take the Barlow Toll Road. Can you explain what that puzzle would have been, and why wasn't it included?
Okay. Yeah, the Barlow Toll Road was a particularly difficult route in real life. It was very steep, narrow. It was very hard to get your oxen. It's all right. You had the oxen and wagon over this pass. Some people would get mules instead to try to get their stuff over. People ended up having to use ropes and pulleys because they would have to frequently unhook the oxen from the wagons in order to pull the wagons up over slopes. They used levers to get them over ruts and rocks. All this seemed like a rich opportunity for some kind of game included in the product. I also very much liked the idea that the product would have this grand finale where you have a choice of two different games to do the last 100 miles. One would be the rafting game, an action game. The other one would be this Barlow Toll Road game that was going to be essentially a puzzle game. How do I use these pulleys and ropes and levers in a way to successfully get over this mountain without breaking anything, without breaking the axles or wheel, without having the wagon run away from me and crash and destroy everything. I like that idea very much, but all throughout the product, I had to prioritize what's most important now, what's most important in this month, what's important next month. And there were several reasons that this particular module got deprioritized. One was that I was never sure that we would have a successful design for this module. Another one was that nothing else depended on it. It was the very last step in the game, and therefore we didn't have to develop it in order to test other things. And on. There were various reasons that kept getting deprioritized. And finally, we got to the point where, okay, this is not high enough priority to make it into the game at all. It's just going to have to get cut. There were a lot of things that got cut.
Yeah, you also were originally going to have an option where they could abandon the wagon and just sort of go on horseback if they needed to. That was also an abandoned part. Was that also abandoned for the same priority?
Yes. I always thought it was a bit humorous, so we had to abandon the idea of abandoning the wagon. But yes, it was as of January, which was, the project started in October. So October, November, December, January. In the 4th month of the product, I still thought that both of those modules were going to be in there. But then it just did not work out. We had limited space on the disk. We had limited space and memory of the Apple II. We had a limited budget. We had a big budget, but still a limited budget to create the product. And we just had to decide in each case, what can we actually make work and get this thing done? And so we had to abandon this idea of abandoning the wagon.
Moving on, the Tombstones have become kind of a favorite aspect of mine, and I think many other people. One of the things I really loved in school was you could see the tombstones of all the classmates who failed. How did that idea of the Tombstones even come about?
Well, I don't think the original idea was mine. I'm pretty sure that it came out of a conversation with Shirley and John and Sherilyn, my 3 core teammates. And as we were, I think it might have even been a humorous joke. I'm not the idea at first. But then as we thought about it, we thought, we could do something like this, and it would be fairly simple. And I particularly liked the idea that it was compensation for having failed. So in other words, right at the moment when the student might feel the player might feel disappointed for having died, you get this humorous little consolation prize of being able to create a tombstone. Then for later players who took the route and seeing these tombstones, that was a very realistic aspect, reflecting the real Oregon Trail that you would see grave sites, not really tombstones, but grave sites along the way, maybe with simple wooden markers on them. So I liked that idea very much. And then when I explored it, I talked it over with John, he's the lead programmer, saying, okay, can we fit this in? We came up with an idea and said, yes, this can actually work. We can do it cheaply and we can make it work. So let's put it in. And we did. But then we found out students abusing it by putting in inappropriate language. And then we had to put in the ability for it to erase the tombstones as well.
I understand that another aspect of the game that you really wanted to include was the ability for the player to talk to multiple people throughout the game. And you weren't able to do that, but could you elaborate more on what you wished you could have done with that feature of talking to more people?
Sure. What I wanted to do was my original concept for the game was that it would be built primarily around interactions with people, and that you would be aware of people at all times. And some of these things got in. We did get talking to people in, but we couldn't fit in any pictures of the people. So at every landmark, you got 3 different conversations or brief conversations that you can have with people at this particular landmark. But most of the other human interactions that happen on the trail just couldn't get in. I wanted to be able to have, for instance, bargaining with traders and bargaining with Native Americans along the way. Where that really a pretty elaborate experience. There were some other ones that I thought were rather interesting based on real history. One that was kind of touchy that looked really interesting was the idea that on the real Oregon Trail, on the first half of the trail, sometimes the prairie Indians there would set up toll stations. For instance, they would usually on a log bridge crossing a stream, and they would ask passerbys to pay a very small fee, like 50 cents. And they were doing this because their way of life had been so disrupted by all these people coming through that had driven away the game and grazed away the grass and so on. I thought, well, this is fascinating. And this is a human interaction based on real history. But for a number of reasons, I was not able to include that idea or several of the other ideas that we had for human interactions along the trail.
And some of your speeches and papers you've noted about the different styles of learning and different styles of teaching, such as the Montessori style, which I'm kind of a big fan of. And I think it's clear that given the various options that you gave players in the game, you sort of had that philosophy in mind when you were programming it. How do you think this game has impacted the way educators across the country approach teaching?
Oh, yes, interesting question. At the time that I was doing this game, and also the Munchers, beginning the Munchers series, I did have some internal opposition within MECC. That is, there were some people who felt this is not how we use computers in education. Computers should be a pretest, then a delivery of instruction, and then a quiz to see if you learned it, and then remediation, and then move on to the next instructional module. And that was the way teaching on the computers should be. My interest all along had been exploratory learning. Even back before I joined MECC, I was very interested in, well, what if we create simulations of the world and allow kids to play with these and learn by experimenting and giving them free rein to fail and try again and try different things. So that was my philosophy. I didn't invent that philosophy. There were other people who were creating simulations back in the 70s on timeshare systems. But I was certainly played an important role in helping to increase awareness of this approach through this Oregon Trail. Even the original Oregon Trail, though, was an example of this philosophy. So I can't even lay claim to that.
Going a little more into that, and some of your other papers and speeches, you mentioned how boredom is learning's worst enemy. Sort of like comparing dietetic learning and non-dietetic learning, can you discuss a little more about those two philosophies?
Okay. Yeah. So I did have that presentation once upon a time where I was talking about the distinction between what at the time I was calling didactic versus non-didactic learning, or teaching, and the idea was that is the objective to somehow broadcast knowledge across the room to a room of students, or is the real objective to facilitate learning in each and every one of those students sitting there? And if you distinguish between those two approaches, it leads to very different ideas as to how to go about the process of teaching and learning. So that's what I was really interested in, is how do we inspire the kids to learn rather than just throw information across the room? So that was the philosophy I certainly took in the Oregon Trail. When the Oregon Trail came out, some people said, this is not an educational product. It doesn't do enough overt teaching. And, in a sense, they're right. But actually, I thought that was a strength, not a weakness. Because what it does is it inspires the curiosity of the kids. First off, it exposes the kids. Afterwards, the kids are familiar with lots of terms and concepts that they didn't know before, like Chimney Rock suddenly means something to them. And the dolls and Columbia River and all these geographic terms, all these little bits of information that later on they hear them and they say, oh, I know a little bit about that. And it piques their curiosity. The game itself encourages additional learning, like, wow, I'm having a hard time at this part of the game. I wonder if I talk to other people, maybe I can learn something that will help me do better in the game. So the game itself encourages a bit of learning in order to do better at the game. So in a whole lot of ways, I found the product to be teaching through inspiration rather than teaching by throwing huge wads of information at people.
Very interesting. Teaching through inspiration instead of just throwing wads at them. That's a good way to put that. Can you just for like a couple of minutes explain what you're doing these days after you left MECC and sort of what happened after all this?
Oh, that's a lot of years to cover, but I can give you a very brief summary. So I spent a total of 18 years designing educational computer software. I left that field in the late 1990s and moved into the development of web-based applications for corporations. Primarily as a user interface designer and user experience designer. I did that for about 14 years. Then just a few years ago, about 3 years ago, I retired from that in order to devote my time to pursuing my passions, which include writing and photography, and perhaps eventually doing some games again. But I'm emphasizing the writing right now, and I do have a weekly blog that covers a number of topics in natural sciences and the linguistics. That's called the Philippendium, and it's on Medium.
Yes, and we have a link to that below in the description of the video. My guest today was Philip Bouchard. He was the designer of the 1985 Oregon Trail game. Many of you will call it the original Oregon Trail game, but that's not accurate, as we just discussed this hour. His book, You Died of Dysentery, is available on Amazon and wherever else books are sold. Philip, I appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you, Ben. I enjoyed it very much.